All right, so picture this. You're running your own business, or maybe you're working on a team, and everything's moving to the cloud these days, right?
Yep.
And all of a sudden you start hearing these acronyms thrown around left and right, like SOC2, MPA, PCI, DSS. And it's like, whoa, what is all this? What does it actually mean for me, for my company?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really what we want to dive into today in this deep dive.
Exactly.
Really kind of unpack all that jargon around cloud compliance, get down to like, what does it actually require? And what are the key things that you should be thinking about to make sure that your data is safe and that you are meeting the standards that you need to meet?
Absolutely. And we've got some great resources to help us do this today. Some excerpts from some documents outlining, the key cloud compliance regulations, strategies around that, and then also some of the common concerns that businesses are facing,
Yeah,
when it comes to this whole area.
definitely.
So let's jump right in.
Okay.
What is cloud compliance like? If you had to boil it down to like one sentence, what is it all about?
So at its most basic level, cloud compliance is about ensuring that your cloud-based systems are meeting the requirements of your customers,
Okay.
but it's also a lot more than that.
Right.
Because it's also about demonstrating adherence to like a whole range of things like regulatory standards laws at the local, national, and even international level.
Yeah.
And then also any standards that your customers set. And then, of course, your own internal governance policies.
Right. It's such a huge area, and it seems like it's really exploded, just in the last few years, even. Like I remember seeing some stats on just how much data is in the cloud now.
It's incredible. Yeah, it's been an exponential growth. And, just looking back to 2022, 50% of all corporate data was already in the cloud.
Wow.
And then even more telling, I think, is that 70% of business applications were SOC applications.
Yeah.
So this means for you that cloud compliance isn't just a nice to have, it's actually a fundamental requirement now for scalability and just to manage all those regulations that are out there.
Right. It's not optional anymore.
No,
Yeah.
not all.
If you are touching the cloud in any way, shape, or form,
Yeah.
you've got to understand compliance.
Right.
So where do you even begin? If you're starting to think about cloud compliance strategy, like where do you even start with that?
That's a great question. And I think the first thing you need to do is when you're starting out, you have to ask yourself these 5 key questions.
Okay.
And the first one is, which regulations actually apply to me?
Okay.
Because that's where those terms you mentioned before, like SOC2, HIPAA, PCI, DSS,
Right.
that's where they come into play because it depends on your industry and the type of data you handle.
Got it. So first step, figure out what applies to you.
Exactly.
What's next?
And then the next key question is all about accountability.
Okay.
So who is actually responsible for what when it comes to compliance?
Right.
And this really depends on the cloud service model that you've adopted. So are you using infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platform as a service, or some combination of all 3?
Right.
And also your deployment model. So is it public-private or hybrid? And so what's really interesting here is how this shared responsibility model works, because for you, if you're using IGOSs, it's kind of like renting an empty office space.
No.
You're responsible for, the security cameras, the locks on the door, all that stuff.
Right.
But if you're using SaaS, it's more like using a fully serviced co-working space.
Okay.
So the provider is handling a lot of the underlying security, but you're still responsible for how you use the space and the data that you store there.
Right. You're still responsible for your own stuff.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Exactly.
All right. What's question number 3?
So question number 3 is all about access control.
Okay.
You need to define and implement what we call granular access controls for all different types of users that are interacting with your cloud environment.
Right.
So think about it. You might have employees who are working in the office. You might have remote teams. You might have third-party vendors all needing access to your cloud environment.
That's a lot of different people.
Right. And they're all going to need different levels of access to different applications and servers and networks and files.
Got it.
So it's about making sure that the right people have the right level of access.
Right. Not giving everybody keys to the kingdom.
Yeah, not everybody needs the master key.
All right. What's number 4?
Number 4 is encryption.
Okay.
So even if your cloud service providers offer encryption, you need to make sure that your data is encrypted both in transit and at rest.
Okay.
So in transit, meaning like when it's moving between systems, and at rest, meaning when it's just sitting there on a server.
Got it.
And relying solely on your provider's default encryption might not be enough.
Okay.
You might need to implement your own encryption methods on top of that.
Right. Like an extra layer.
Yeah, exactly. Just to add that extra layer of security.
Right. And the 5th key question.
So the fifth question is the need for regular security audits.
Okay.
So these are kind of like your ongoing health checks for your cloud environment, and they can help you identify any vulnerabilities and make sure that you're staying up to date with all the changing rules and best practices.
Right. So it's not just a one-time thing. You got to keep checking up on.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process.
Okay, so those 5 questions, I think, really kind of lay the groundwork for getting started
Yeah, absolutely.
with cloud compliance.
Yeah.
But now let's actually dig into some of those specific regulations that you mentioned before,
Okay.
like SOC 2, for example. What is that all about?
So SOC 2 stands for Systems and Organization Controls 2.
Okay.
And it's probably the broadest and most versatile framework that we'll talk about today because it's not tied to any particular industry,
Okay.
but it lays out criteria for managing customer data
Right.
based on what are called the 5 Trust Service Criteria, or TSC.
Okay.
And those are security, privacy, availability, processing, integrity, and confidentiality.
Okay, that's a lot of words.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is unlike some regulations that might emphasize 1 or 2 of those, all 5 of these criteria are actually relevant in SOC 2. So security is all about protecting your systems from unauthorized access and use. And that's about protecting your reputation.
Right.
Availability is making sure your systems are up and running when they need to be. So that's about service delivery.
Makes sense.
Processing integrity verifies that system processing is complete, accurate, and timely authorized and valid.
Okay.
Confidentiality is protecting information that's designated as confidential from unauthorized disclosure.
Yeah.
And privacy is about the collection, use, retention, disclosure, and disposal of personal information in accordance with your commitments and system requirements.
Got it. So who needs to worry about SOC 2 compliance? Who does that apply to?
So generally, SOC 2 applies to any service organization.
Okay.
So that could be vendors, third-party service providers, SOS platforms, PaaS platforms,
Right.
basically anyone who's accessing, processing, transferring, or storing client data in the cloud.
Got it.
So if we think about if your business relies on third-party cloud services, which is increasingly common these days, then SOC 2 is probably something that you need to be aware of.
Oh.
Either for your own organization, or you need to make sure that the vendors that you're using are SOC 2 compliant.
Right, because it's all about trust at the end of the day.
Exactly.
So where did SOC 2 even come from? Like, how did this whole thing get started?
Well, it really came about because of the growth of cloud computing and outsourcing.
Okay.
Because with that came this increased concern around liability and data protection.
Right. People are a little nervous about putting their data out there.
Exactly. And so companies needed a way to make sure that those service providers handling their data were doing it securely and responsibly.
Right.
And so SOC 2 was developed to provide that assurance through a standardized reporting framework.
Okay. That makes sense in our, interconnected world.
Right.
All right, let's move on to another big one. HIPAA. This is one that we hear a lot about, especially in healthcare.
Absolutely. HIPAA, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act,
Right.
is super important for anyone operating in healthcare because it's all about safeguarding what's called protected health information, or PHI.
Right.
And so for you, if you're in healthcare, this isn't just a recommendation, it's a legal obligation.
Wow.
And there are pretty significant consequences if you don't comply.
Okay, so if you're handling any kind of patient data, you've got to be HIPAA compliant.
Exactly. And any organization that comes into possession of PHI, regardless of the volume,
Wow.
is required to implement a set of safeguards to make sure that that data is protected from unauthorized access, use, or disclosure.
Okay, and what kind of safeguards are we talking about here?
So key requirements include things like strong authentication mechanisms and access controls.
Okay.
And that's to verify user identities and limit data access.
Right, make sure the right people are getting in.
Exactly. And then you also need to conduct periodic security risk assessments to identify potential vulnerabilities.
Okay.
And then finally, ensure that any ePHI or electronically stored PHI is properly encrypted both in transit and at rest.
Got it. So who exactly does HIPAA apply to? Is it just hospitals and doctors' offices?
Well, it's actually broader than that.
Okay.
It applies to what are called covered entities, which include healthcare providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses.
Okay.
But it also extends to what are called business associates and even their subcontractors,
Okay.
who perform certain functions or activities on behalf of covered entities.
Right, so it kind of ripples outward.
Exactly. And those functions involve the use or disclosure of PHI.
So if you touch PHI in any way, you're probably under HIPAA.
That's right. It's always better to err on the side of caution when you're dealing with such sensitive information.
Right. Makes sense. All right, last but not least, PCI, DSS, what is that all about?
So PCI DSS stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard.
Okay.
And it's a set of policies and procedures that are designed to protect credit, debit, and cash card transactions
Okay.
and really prevent misuse of cardholder data, or CHD.
Okay. And with so much happening online these days with payments, this seems like a really big one.
It's huge. Yeah. And with the increase in online shopping and digital financial interactions, it's becoming more and more important.
Right. So if your business processes payments in any way, PCI DSS is something you need to know about.
Absolutely.
So how is it different from IPI, for example?
So IPA is a U.S. federal law, but PCI DSS is actually an industry-driven standard.
Okay.
It's managed by the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council,
Right.
which is a global forum that was created by the major payment card brands.
Oh, wow. So like Visa, MasterCard, all those guys?
Exactly. Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, they all got together and said, hey, we need to make sure that payment card transactions are secure.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what are some of the actual requirements that PCI DSS lays out?
So it's structured around 6 main control objectives.
Okay.
And there are a bunch of specific requirements that fall under each one.
Okay, give me an example.
Okay, so the first one is to build and maintain a secure network. And one specific requirement under that is to not use those default passwords that vendors supply for systems.
Oh, yeah, you always got to change those.
Right, always change the defaults.
Good advice.
Another objective is to protect cardholder data.
Okay.
And one of the requirements there is to encrypt the transmission of cardholder data across public networks.
Makes sense.
You also need to maintain a vulnerability management program, which includes things like regularly updating your antivirus software.
Right.
And you need to implement strong access control measures, which means restricting access to cardholder data based on need to know.
Right.
You have to regularly monitor and test networks, including things like tracking all access to your systems.
Got it.
And then finally, maintain an information security policy
Go ahead.
that outlines your overall security practices.
Wow. So it's pretty comprehensive.
It's pretty thorough, yeah.
And who has to comply with this? Is it just like big online retailers, or is it broader than that?
It's actually much broader. It applies to any entity that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data.
Oh, wow.
So that's pretty much any merchant who accepts or processes payment cards.
Really?
Regardless of size or volume of transactions.
So it's better to just assume that it applies to you.
Yeah, if you're handling credit card information in any way, you should assume that PCI DSS applies to you.
Okay, that's a good rule of thumb. All right, so we've covered SOC2, ITA, PCI, DSS.
We have.
And, you know, they all kind of have this idea of data protection in common.
Right.
But how are they different? Like, what are the key differences between them?
Yeah, so if we compare them head to head, SOC2 is a broad framework focused on service organizations.
Okay.
And it's evaluated against those 5 trust service criteria.
Right.
It's not specific to any industry. And it really depends on whether you're processing client data in the cloud.
Right.
ITA, on the other hand, is a U.S. law.
Okay.
That's very specific to healthcare, and its focus is protecting protected health information. And then PCI DSS is this industry-driven standard that applies to anyone handling cardholder data.
Okay.
And its goal is to secure payment card transactions.
Right. So they all have kind of different areas of focus.
Yeah, they have overlaps, but they also have very distinct areas of focus.
So beyond the specifics of these regulations, what are some of the things that businesses need to keep in mind when they're trying to achieve cloud compliance? Like, what are the big picture things?
Yeah, so understanding the individual regulations is just one part of it.
Right.
There are these bigger overarching themes that are really important, and we've talked about some of them already, but they bear repeating.
Okay.
Things like making sure you clearly define who's accountable for what.
Right.
And that depends on your specific cloud model.
Okay.
And then making sure that you implement those granular access controls.
Right.
So that you're limiting data access based on roles and responsibilities.
Okay.
And of course, encryption,
Yeah.
making sure your data is encrypted both when it's moving and when it's just sitting there. And then those regular security audits.
Right. Those health checks.
Exactly, to make sure that you're staying on top of everything.
Okay. So it's not just about checking boxes. It's really about creating this culture of security.
That's exactly it. Yeah, it's about embedding it into your operations.
Okay. So to kind of make this more concrete, we had some information about how a company called JP Stream approaches cloud compliance.
Right.
And I think this is a good example of how this stuff actually works in the real world.
Yeah. They've got a multi-pronged approach that focuses on protecting sensitive data and building that trust with their clients.
Yeah.
They've got partnerships with all the leading security vendors.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of experience working in those highly regulated sectors like healthcare and fintech.
Right. So they're in the trenches.
They're right there in the thick of it.
So what are some of the specific things that they do?
So they start with security assessments to understand the client's business and the regulatory landscape.
Okay.
Then they help set up secure landing zones in the cloud, often using that zero trust access model,
Okay.
which means you only get the bare minimum permissions that you need.
Right. No more, no less.
Exactly. And then they implement continuous monitoring and logging
Okay.
so that they're keeping track of everything that's going on.
Right.
They do ongoing risk assessments
Oh,
to identify and address any threats.
got it.
And then they help clients establish governance benchmarks to meet those certifications and accreditations.
Oh.
And finally, they offer penetration testing.
Oh, wow. So they're really trying to break in and see where the weaknesses are?
Exactly. They're trying to find those vulnerabilities before the bad guys do.
Right. That's really smart.
Yeah, so it's a really comprehensive approach.
It is.
And it shows the kind of support that's available to companies to really help them manage all this complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways that you want our listeners to remember about cloud compliance?
So the most important thing is that cloud compliance is not just a technical issue, it's a business imperative. You know, we're living in a digital world now, and you've got to take this seriously.
Absolutely.
It's complex. It involves understanding all these regulations and standards like SOC 2, HIPAA, PCI, DSS.
Right.
Figuring out which ones apply to you,
Okay.
and then taking those proactive steps to protect your data.
Right.
Things like defining accountability, strong access controls, encryption, regular audits, all that stuff.
It's a lot, but it's important.
It is a lot, but it's absolutely essential.
So hopefully after listening to this, you, the listener, you've got a better grasp on all these concepts. And you've got some ideas about what you need to do to get started on your own compliance journey.
Right. And thinking ahead, you know, we're only going to get more interconnected in the cloud.
Yeah,
So this is something that's going to keep evolving, and it's going to present new challenges.
absolutely.
So it's important to stay informed.
So for you listening, think about how is this all going to change in the next few years? What are the new challenges that are coming down the pike?
Yeah,
That's something to really ponder.
it is.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See